There is a version of history where the Twin Towers were always beloved, where New York embraced them from the moment they rose above the skyline, where their destruction on September 11th, 2001, was the loss of cherished landmarks that the city had always treasured. That version is a lie. The truth is preserved in newspapers, magazines, architecture journals, and public testimony from the 3 decades before the attacks. The words are still there for anyone willing to look. Critics called the towers monstrosities. Architects called them boring. New Yorkers called them ugly. The public record is filled with contempt, mockery, and outright hostility toward buildings that would later be sanctified through tragedy. This is what people actually said about the World Trade Center before history was rewritten. The architects speak. The architectural establishment rejected the Twin Towers almost immediately. These were not fringe voices. They were the most respected critics in America, writing for the most prestigious publications. Lewis Mumford was arguably the most influential architecture critic of the 20th century. His books had shaped how Americans thought about cities for decades. When the World Trade Center plans were unveiled, Mumford did not hold back. He described the project as an example of what he termed purposeless gigantism. The towers, in his view, represented the ultimate triumph of geometric form over human content. He saw them as buildings designed to impress through sheer size rather than to serve any human need that required such scale. Mumford placed the World Trade Center within a larger pattern of urban destruction. He had spent years arguing that American cities were being demolished and rebuilt according to principles that ignored how people actually lived. The towers were, to him, the most extreme expression of this failure, monuments to ego disguised as progress. Ada Louise Huxtable held the position of architecture critic at the New York Times, the most influential platform for architectural commentary in the country. Her reviews could make or break buildings and careers. She approached the World Trade Center with deep skepticism. Huxtable acknowledged the engineering achievement but questioned everything else. She noted that the towers would dump 50,000 workers onto streets and transit systems that could not handle them. She questioned whether buildings of such overwhelming scale could ever create humane environments at street level. Her criticism focused on what she saw as a fundamental design failure, the prioritization of maximum rentable floor space over the creation of places where people would actually want to be. The towers were machines for generating revenue, not architecture in any meaningful sense. Huxtable would later observe that the plaza spaces at the base of the towers were windswept and hostile, exactly the environment she had predicted. The buildings performed as commercial products while failing as urban places. Paul Goldberger, who would later succeed Huxtable at the Times, was equally unimpressed. He described the towers as so utterly banal as to be unworthy of the headquarters of a great corporation, let alone a series of buildings that claimed to represent the importance of world trade. The word banal appeared repeatedly in architectural criticism of the towers. The buildings were not interestingly bad. They were not dramatically ugly. They were simply boring, repetitive facades of identical floors stacked to arbitrary height. The Empire State Building had setbacks, ornamentation, a distinctive crown. The Chrysler Building had its iconic Art Deco spire. The Twin Towers had nothing except more of themselves. Wolf von Eckhart, architecture critic for the Washington Post, called the towers the biggest erector set in the world. He saw them as oversized toys rather than serious architecture, buildings designed by engineers who had solved structural problems without ever asking whether the result would enrich human experience. The criticism extended beyond American shores. British critics were particularly savage. One described the towers as glass and metal filing cabinets that treated human beings as items to be stored rather than people to be served. Minoru Yamasaki, the architect who designed the towers, seemed to understand the criticism even as he defended his work. In interviews, he acknowledged that the extreme height had been driven by the Port Authority's desire for maximum floor space, not by any architectural vision. He had originally proposed a more varied complex of buildings at different heights. The client wanted the world's tallest buildings. Yamasaki gave them what they wanted. In one revealing comment, Yamasaki admitted that he himself was afraid of heights, and that the narrow windows were partly a response to his own discomfort with being able to see straight down from extreme elevation. The windows that critics attacked as prison-like were, in part, a reflection of the architect's personal anxiety. The displaced speak. While architects debated aesthetics, the people whose neighborhood was being destroyed spoke in more direct terms. Oscar Newman owned an electronics shop on Cortlandt Street in the heart of Radio Row. When the Port Authority announced plans to demolish the neighborhood, Newman became the most visible voice of opposition. His words captured the fury of small business owners watching their livelihoods disappear. Newman described the World Trade Center as a project designed to benefit the wealthy and powerful at the expense of working people. The Port Authority, he argued, was using government power to seize private property and hand it to corporations. The fact that this was technically legal did not make it right. In public testimony, Newman challenged the premise that the World Trade Center served any public purpose. The buildings would house banks and trading firms, private businesses that could locate anywhere. How was destroying a functioning neighborhood to build office space for corporations a legitimate use of eminent domain? Newman's arguments failed in court, but his words remain in the record. He called the project an act of institutional violence against ordinary people. He predicted that the towers would stand half-empty while the businesses they displaced would never recover. He was right about both. Other Radio Row merchants added their voices. Many had operated in the same locations for decades. Their fathers and grandfathers had built the businesses. Customers came from across the region because Radio Row offered what could not be found elsewhere: specialized knowledge, rare components, the accumulated expertise of a commercial ecosystem that had developed organically over generations. One shop owner, testifying at a public hearing, asked a simple question: who gave them the right to destroy what we spent our lives building? The answer, of course, was that the Port Authority had given itself that right through a legal structure designed to insulate the agency from democratic accountability. But the question haunted the project. The people whose lives were disrupted had no meaningful voice in the decision. They could only watch as their neighborhood was erased. The demolition photographs from 1966 and 1967 show middle-aged men standing on sidewalks as police board up the shops they had operated for years. Their expressions tell the story that the official record obscures. The city speaks. New Yorkers are not known for diplomatic restraint. The public response to the Twin Towers reflected the city's characteristic bluntness. When the towers were completed in the early 1970s, surveys found that most New Yorkers disliked them. The buildings were seen as ugly, out of scale, and representative of everything wrong with modern development. People compared them unfavorably to the city's beloved pre-war skyscrapers. The Empire State Building, then 40 years old, remained the building New Yorkers claimed as their own. It had style, personality, history. The Twin Towers had only height. Letters to newspaper editors throughout the 1970s reflect this sentiment. Writers called the towers monstrosities, eyesores, and the ugly sisters. One letter described them as filing cabinets for people, a phrase that captured the sense that the buildings treated human beings as items to be processed rather than individuals to be accommodated. The observation deck drew tourists, but New Yorkers generally avoided it. If you wanted to see the city from above, you went to the Empire State Building. It was a tradition, a rite of passage, a building that meant something. The World Trade Center was just tall. Popular culture reflected and amplified these attitudes. The 1976 remake of King Kong moved the climactic scene from the Empire State Building to the Twin Towers. The original film, made in 1933, had used the Empire State Building as a symbol of human achievement, a monument worthy of Kong's final stand. By 1976, the symbolism had shifted. The Twin Towers represented something colder, more corporate, less romantic. Kong's rampage across the towers played as spectacle, but also as fantasy. Watching the unpopular buildings get damaged carried a certain satisfaction that audiences may not have consciously acknowledged. Television shows and films of the era used the towers as visual shorthand for corporate dehumanization. When directors wanted to establish that characters worked in a soulless environment, they showed the Twin Towers. The buildings had become code for institutional indifference. The workers speak. The people who actually worked in the towers offered a more complicated perspective. Their daily experience revealed problems that critics had predicted and that the Port Authority had dismissed. Elevator complaints were constant. The system required workers to transfer between express and local elevators at sky lobbies. Getting from the ground floor to an upper floor office could take 15 or 20 minutes during peak hours. Workers described the morning commute within the building as an ordeal. The narrow windows created offices that felt claustrophobic to some workers. Natural light penetrated only a short distance from the perimeter. Workers in interior offices spent their days under fluorescent lighting with no view of the outside world. On windy days, the towers swayed noticeably. The movement was within engineering tolerances, but workers on upper floors could feel it. Coffee rippled in cups. Papers shifted on desks. Some workers reported motion sickness. Others simply found the sensation unsettling, a constant reminder that they were suspended a quarter-mile above the ground in a structure that moved. The plaza spaces were universally despised by the workers who had to cross them. Wind accelerated through the gap between the towers, creating conditions that could knock people off balance. In winter, the wind chill made the plaza crossing genuinely dangerous. Workers learned to enter through underground passages whenever possible. Yet other workers defended the buildings. The views from upper floors were spectacular. The sense of being at the center of global finance had appeal. Some workers took pride in the tower's status as the world's tallest buildings, a distinction that lasted only briefly before the Sears Tower claimed the title. The workers' ambivalence reflected the building's essential character. The towers worked as functional office space. They did not work as places that inspired affection or loyalty. People worked there because their employers leased space there, not because they chose the environment. The crisis years. The 1970s added economic failure to aesthetic criticism. The towers opened into recession and remained substantially vacant for years. The Port Authority's projections had assumed that corporations would compete for space. Instead, the buildings sat empty while New York City collapsed financially around them. Critics pointed to the towers as symbols of misplaced priorities. The Port Authority had spent nearly $1 billion constructing office buildings that nobody wanted to rent, while the city could not afford to maintain basic services. The distinction between Port Authority finances and city finances was technically accurate but emotionally irrelevant. The buildings represented resources that could have been used differently. Newspaper editorials questioned whether the project had ever made sense. The towers had been justified as catalysts for Lower Manhattan's revival. Instead, they had added millions of square feet of empty office space to an already oversupplied market, driving down rents and threatening the viability of older buildings throughout the financial district. The Port Authority filled the towers by pressuring government agencies to relocate. State offices moved from other locations to the World Trade Center. The agency essentially leased space to itself and to entities that had no choice. This was not the market success that had been promised. Political criticism intensified as the city's fiscal crisis deepened. Politicians asked why the Port Authority was subsidizing empty towers while schools were closing and police officers were being laid off. The agency's independence, which had allowed it to proceed without democratic approval, now insulated it from democratic accountability. The Port Authority answered to governors, not to the public whose city was struggling. The towers became symbols of institutional arrogance. They stood for the belief that experts knew better than communities, that large-scale intervention could solve complex problems, that progress required destruction. All of these premises were increasingly questioned as the towers rose half-empty against a city in decline. The long rehabilitation. The criticism diminished gradually as economic conditions changed. By the mid-1980s, the financial services industry was booming. Office space in Lower Manhattan was in demand. The towers finally achieved the occupancy rates that had been projected 2 decades earlier. Economic success did not erase aesthetic objections, but it muted them. Critics who had attacked the towers as failed monuments to hubris found it harder to sustain that argument when the buildings were fully leased and generating substantial revenue. The Port Authority pointed to the numbers. Whatever the towers looked like, they were working. The architectural criticism faded from public discourse. Lewis Mumford had died. Ada Louise Huxtable had moved on to other subjects. The battles over modernism that had made the towers controversial belonged to an earlier era. New controversies occupied the critics. The towers became part of the background, buildings that people no longer bothered to have opinions about. Windows on the World, the restaurant on the top floors of the North Tower, helped rehabilitate the building's image. The restaurant was genuinely excellent, praised by food critics, popular with New Yorkers celebrating special occasions. It provided positive associations that the towers had lacked. People who would never have visited the World Trade Center otherwise came for dinner and discovered that the views were spectacular and the experience memorable. The observation deck became a standard tourist destination. Visitors from around the world came to stand at the top of what had been the world's tallest buildings. The towers appeared on postcards, in tourist brochures, in the establishing shots of films and television shows set in New York. By the 1990s, the transformation was substantial. The buildings that New York had hated for 2 decades had become accepted features of the skyline. They were not beloved the way the Empire State Building was beloved, but they were no longer actively resented. They had achieved the urban equivalent of tolerance. The 1993 bombing accelerated this shift. The attack killed 6 people and revealed the tower's vulnerability to terrorism, but it also generated solidarity. New Yorkers rallied around the damaged buildings. Workers returned to their offices within weeks. The towers had been attacked, and the city's response was to defend them. The buildings that had been symbols of institutional arrogance became symbols of resilience. The Port Authority published assurances about structural integrity. The message was clear: we will not be driven from these buildings by violence. By September 10, 2001, the World Trade Center had completed a journey from hated to tolerated to accepted to something approaching valued. The architectural criticism was forgotten. The Radio Row displacement was forgotten. The empty years of the 1970s were forgotten. The towers had become facts of New York life that no longer required justification. The erasure. And then, in a single morning, all of that history disappeared. The attacks of September 11th transformed the Twin Towers instantly and completely. Buildings that had been criticized for 30 years became sacred. The complicated history of controversy, failure, and gradual rehabilitation was replaced by a simplified narrative of beloved landmarks destroyed by evil. Within weeks of the attacks, it became impossible to say anything negative about the towers. The critics who had savaged the buildings for decades fell silent. To mention the aesthetic failures or the displacement of Radio Row felt obscene. How could anyone discuss architecture when thousands had died? The question was understandable. Grief demands simplification. Mourning does not accommodate nuance. The people who died in the towers were victims regardless of what anyone thought about the buildings. Honoring them seemed to require honoring the place where they died. But the erasure went beyond appropriate mourning. The actual history of the Twin Towers was actively suppressed, replaced by a narrative that served emotional needs but distorted the past. The memorial that now occupies the site reflects this transformation. The reflecting pools mark where the towers stood. The names of the victims are inscribed in bronze. The space is designed for remembrance. There is no mention of Radio Row. There is no acknowledgement of Oscar Newman or the 323 businesses destroyed. There is no reference to the decades of criticism or the years of financial failure. The towers are presented as innocent victims, which they were, but they are also presented as buildings that were always cherished, which they were not. What the quotes tell us? The quotes collected here are not obscure. They appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, major architecture journals, and public hearing transcripts. They were spoken by respected critics, ordinary workers, displaced business owners, and everyday New Yorkers. These voices tell us something important, that buildings exist in history, that they are created through processes involving conflict and controversy, that their meanings change over time. The Twin Towers were not born as symbols of American achievement. They became symbols through a complicated process that included decades of failure and criticism before eventual acceptance. Understanding this history does not diminish the tragedy of September 11th. It does not disrespect the victims. It enriches our understanding of what was lost by acknowledging its full complexity. The people who criticized the towers were not wrong. The buildings were aesthetically unsuccessful. They did destroy a functioning neighborhood. They did represent institutional power wielded without democratic accountability. They did stand half-empty for years while the city struggled. All of this is true. It is also true that the towers eventually succeeded economically, that they became iconic parts of the skyline, that they provided workplaces for tens of thousands, that their destruction killed nearly 3,000 innocent people. These truths coexist. They do not cancel each other. History is complicated enough to contain all of them. The quotes preserved in the historical record remind us of what we have chosen to forget. They are voices from a time when it was still possible to see the Twin Towers clearly, not as sacred symbols, but as controversial buildings with contested histories. Those voices deserve to be heard, not because they diminish the loss, but because they honor the truth. The Twin Towers were never simple. They do not become simple because they were destroyed. The complexity deserves remembering, even when remembering is difficult. Especially when remembering is difficult. Coda. Oscar Newman, the Radio Row shop owner who fought the tower's construction and lost, lived long enough to see the buildings destroyed. His reaction is not recorded in any archive I have found. One can only imagine what he felt watching the towers fall. The buildings that had destroyed his livelihood, that had erased his neighborhood, that had been built over his protests and against his will, those buildings were gone. But so were nearly 3,000 people who had nothing to do with the decisions made decades earlier. Workers who had simply gone to their offices. Visitors who happened to be in the wrong place. First responders who ran toward the disaster. Newman had been right about the towers. He had been right that they served powerful interests at the expense of ordinary people. He had been right that the project was driven by institutional ego rather than genuine public need. He had been right about all of it. And none of that mattered on September 11th. The people who died were not the people who had made the decisions. They were not the Port Authority officials who had wielded eminent domain. They were not the architects who had designed the buildings. They were not the politicians who had approved the project. They were office workers and restaurant staff and tourists and firefighters. They were people who had simply been there in buildings they had not chosen when history arrived with terrible force. This is the final complexity. The tower's victims bear no responsibility for the tower's history. Remembering what the buildings were does not assign blame to those who died inside them. The critique and the mourning exist in separate moral universes. But both are true. Both deserve acknowledgement. And only by holding both can we understand what was actually lost on September 11th, 2001. Not simple symbols, not uncomplicated landmarks. Buildings that contained multitudes, including all the contradictions, failures, and controversies that preceded their final, terrible morning.